In my lifetime, I've watched the political left and right swap places. This first became apparent in the early 2010s, as the big social media platforms supplanted all the legacy mediums of communication. But in recent years, the phenomenon has accelerated so markedly that it now represents an almost complete inversion. It is important to note at the outset that the terms left and right have become meaningless in the 2020s, and that my usage of them here simply denotes the broad demarcation that is used in the mainstream everyday analysis. Dichotomies such as Democrat versus Republican, Labour versus Conservative, and Socialist versus Capitalist. These are artificial constructs and red herrings to the masses, designed to keep us fighting amongst ourselves and blind to the true nature of our world. I'll discuss this in my next video, linked in the description, but by way of a primer, I want to demonstrate the absurdity of our established bipolar political system by illustrating 5 key points on which the so-called left and right have exchanged their core beliefs in the past 20 years. Number 1. War. I remember when the Twin Towers fell. I remember exactly where I was, who I was with, and what we were doing. The same is likely true for anyone currently over the age of 30. In the aftermath of 9/11, the divide between left and right, which had been conspicuously absent for much of the preceding decade, dramatically reasserted itself, and I remember this vividly also. As the Western war machine geared up, the lines at home were clearly drawn. Lefties screaming "fuck Bush," and the Conservatives cheering on the Patriot Act and the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. At the time this stacked up. It was, it seemed, merely a continuation of the domestic battle lines of the 1960s, with the anti-war left up against the tradcon religious right. Conspiracy theorists, musicians and black sheep journos were united in their anger at the Bush-Cheney regime and their cynical ties to Halliburton. Michael Moore made films about it, Immortal Technique spat angry raps, and Green Day prefaced their seminal rock opera on the subject. It was all very clear and familiar. The liberty-loving left was against the war, and the Looney Tune rights were still the baby killers. But in 2020, this has somehow inverted. The consensus now on the liberal left is for war with Russia. Those who don't advocate for it outright clamour nonetheless for provocative actions like no-fly zones, and for spending billions of our tax dollars on guns and missiles to sustain Ukraine's war effort. In fact, so ubiquitous is the support for a hawkish stance on Putin that even the centrists are on board, and it is only the hardcore right who oppose war. Not only is this a complete inversion of the left's position of 20 years ago on foreign military entanglements, it also exposes a fundamental shift in their attitude towards the armaments industry and other massive corporations. Number 2. Corporations. As recently as 2011, the left-wing view of big corporations was a dismal one, and it was no secret. In the wake of the global financial crisis spawned by the fraudulent behaviour of the big banks, the left came out in force, as indeed it had done for many years on the subject of corrupt financial institutions and globalisation. Occupy Wall Street was the clarion call, and for several months this movement looked as though it might finally hold the international banking elite's feet to the fire. And then, somehow, it all just went away. I'll delve into this in the next video, linked in the description, for it is a critical turning point in our story. But being anti-big business is by no means a recent facet of left-wing thought. It hardly bears pointing out, but the very foundation of socialist dogma lies in the writings of Marx and Engels and their strident condemnation of capitalism and the wealth it concentrates in corporations. It is strange then that in 2022, the liberal left are now the most fervent acolytes of large corporations. As we've already noted, they are enthusiastic about using the public purse to bankroll defence contractors like Raytheon, Boeing and Lockheed Martin. But this phenomenon predates the war in Ukraine by a decade. Consider the early 2010s again. We keep returning to this date because it's pivotal, as I'll discuss in the next video. 2012 marks not only the explosion of social media, as mass smartphone adoption made it possible for people to interact with their networks whenever, wherever, but also the wholesale rebranding of the corporate world. This new breed of corporation was not like the old. The bright young things at Facebook, Twitter, Apple and Google were hip to the cause. So hip in fact that they didn't even call it hip anymore. They had a new, far hipper word: woke. And on the heels of Silicon Valley followed all the other big players: Nike, the NBA, Starbucks, Disney, and of course the entire corporate media complex. These were corporations that millennials could vibe with, corporations that reflected their values. And so now, when Facebook cancels or censors someone for saying the wrong thing, it is not the liberal left crying foul and boycotting the evil corporation. No. They'll tell you it's a private company, it can do what it wants. While in yet another bizarre inversion, it is the so-called right calling for regulation. The faction which, up until 10 years ago, had been the bastion of free market corporate power. Number 3. Censorship. Perhaps the left always loved censorship, and it's only our naive caricature of the Puritan religious right and their hatred of sex, drugs and rock and roll, which they sought to wipe from popular discourse in the 20th century, that has cemented the right in the popular memory as the proponents of censorship. This was certainly true in my lifetime. As a teen, I was incensed no end by the removal of spicy song lyrics and steamy movie scenes by the pencil-necked prudes who staffed many of our public institutions. This was most certainly a right-wing phenomenon at the time, and not a feature of the liberal left. But we need only look back as far as Soviet Russia, or even at many modern-day socialist states, to find rampant examples of left-wing censorship. One could argue that it is simply a feature of authoritarianism, and this is certainly true of left and right. Yet it is also true that throughout the democratic West, widespread support for censorship in the population has migrated from the uptight right in the 80s and 90s to the woke left in the 2010s and 2020s. Since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the left has completely abandoned the fundamental democratic principle of freedom of speech, and instead adopted increasingly hardline demands for the removal of ideas that do not conform to their woke ideology. It began with the removal of popular right-wing personalities from YouTube and Twitter, people like Sargon of Akkad, Tommy Robinson and Milo Yiannopoulos, but has since ramped up dramatically, culminating in the cancellation of a sitting US president and the Biden regime's establishment of a Ministry of Truth, the Disinformation Governance Board, to use the newspeak of the day. Most significantly, during COVID, the liberal left were the cheerleaders not only for the lockdowns, masks and travel restrictions, but also for the burgeoning fact-checking industry, which spawned to combat so-called misinformation on the virus itself and the hurriedly produced vaccines. Through its obfuscation of the facts, this unprecedented wave of big tech censorship served to sustain public support for lockdowns and the other unnecessary measures that have crippled the world economy and created an insolvent financial system whose rampant inflation now threatens to relegate all but the very wealthy to a state of relative poverty. The fact that much of the so-called misinformation has now been proven to be true, that the lockdowns did not work, that masks were ineffectual, that COVID was not a threat to young, healthy people, and indeed that the vaccines themselves were not only ineffective but also unsafe. All this is lost on the liberal left, who continue to shill vehemently for Big Pharma, and to label anyone unwilling to get jabbed as a conspiracy theorist and an anti-vaxxer. Number 4. Vaccines. Every anti-vaxxer I ever knew pre-COVID was on the left of the political spectrum. This is not to say that elements of the religious right did not also occupy this space. But in my experience, the most vocal day-to-day opposition to vaccines came from the organic, dreadlocked, my body, my choice crowd. They were the hippies, the environmentalists, the single mums on welfare, the struggling musicians and the activist types. And I saw this trend reflected online around the world. Yet with the advent of COVID, many of these folk did an about turn, virtually overnight, and the pejorative terms right-wing and anti-vaxxer suddenly became synonymous. Now this is merely my anecdotal experience, yet it is true that the faction within society collectively known as the left have become so publicly enamoured with mRNA vaccines that it has gained a cult-like freneticism. To signal their adulation and unbending compliance, people plastered their social medias with smarmy vaccination day selfies, got vaccine tattoos, produced cringy TikTok odes, salivated religiously over Tony Fauci, and condemned anyone who took a more cautious approach as a Nazi. And of course, who could forget peak vax hysteria? Stephen Colbert's Vaccine, a bilious 10-minute advertainment spectacle for Big Pharma, dressed up as a hokey late-night PSA. But who exactly are these people? Is it really the left? For when one scrolls the comments section of Colbert's video, linked in the description, it's an unbridled deluge of scorn. Here are but 3 of the most upvoted comments. This is genuinely some of the darkest, most sinister shit I've ever seen. Imagine when people watch this back in 50 to 60 years' time. This is honestly one of the most disturbing pieces of propaganda I've ever seen. Saying this is creepy is being kind. This is true horror. One gets the impression when reading these comments, and the hundreds just like them, that most regular folk are not on board with the pageant of enthusiasm for these experimental shots, for which we have no long-term data, and whose clinical trial results the FDA and Pfizer attempted to conceal from the public for 75 years. Yet according to the government stats, 80 to 90% of our populations have indeed rolled up their sleeves. This raises the question both as to how accurate these figures are and how many millions consented to the jab only because they felt coerced. But regardless, the story we're now told by our leaders in the mainstream media is that being anti-vax is now a solidly right-wing position, which is interesting because up until 2021, the issue of bodily autonomy, as now espoused by the far-right anti-vax crowd, had been a cornerstone of left-wing thought. My body, my choice. Ring any bells? I believe there's more to it though. I do not necessarily see a left-right split on this issue, but rather, as I'll discuss in the next video, a class divide. Number 5. The working class. If it wasn't evident throughout most of 2020 and 2021, as the liberal left cheered for lockdowns and business closures, resulting in the greatest ever transfer of wealth from the working and middle classes to the top 1%, and if it wasn't evident over the previous 5 years, when socialism ceased having anything to do with workers' rights, and adopted the intersectional creed of wokeism, and began advocating instead for so-called minorities, then it became undeniable in early 2022, with the spectacular rise of the Canadian truckers' convoy, that the left were no longer the champions of the working class. Wall-to-wall liberal media coverage painted the truckers as neo-Nazis and far-right extremists for the crime of gathering to peacefully protest draconian government vaccine mandates. Little more needs to be said on this topic, so fresh is it in the popular memory. Few issues have been as divisive. Indeed, like the question of vaccine mandates itself, one was either for or against, and saw the truckers either as heroes or villains. There was very little grey area. What cannot be denied, though, is that the trucker convoy was a working class uprising, probably the largest and most significant in living memory. Yet the unmistakable delineation in the public narrative was that the left was opposed to the convoy, and the right, or the far right as indeed was the claim, were its primary advocates. How did this happen? How have our two political poles become so conspicuously inverted? This is a question I will address in the next video, linked in the description. But I'll give you a hint. It's not actually about left and right. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to my Substack at jjdawson.substack.com. And if you'd like to keep in touch, please follow me on Twitter at RealJJDawson. You can also follow me on Getter, Gab and Minds. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it about, because it really helps me out.